During Prohibition in the early 20th century, one of the darkest accusations leveled at the US government turned out to be true. Federal officials knowingly poisoned alcohol, fully aware that American citizens would drink it and die. Prohibition began in 1920 with the passage of the 18th Amendment, banning the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages. What lawmakers failed to account for was how deeply alcohol was embedded in everyday life. Demand didn't disappear, it simply moved underground. Speakeasies appeared in every major city, and bootleggers found creative ways to supply them. One of the most common methods involved stealing industrial alcohol, which was legal to produce for things like fuel, cleaning products, and manufacturing, then redistilling it into drinkable liquor. The federal government quickly realized this was happening. Instead of abandoning prohibition, officials looked for ways to make stolen industrial alcohol unusable. Their solution was not to regulate it more carefully or crack down on distributors, but to deliberately contaminate it. Manufacturers were ordered to add toxic chemicals to industrial alcohol so that anyone attempting to drink it would become sick. At first, the additives were meant to cause discomfort, nausea, headaches, vomiting. When that failed to deter drinkers, the government escalated. By the mid-1920s, industrial alcohol was being denatured with methanol, a highly toxic substance also known as wood alcohol. Methanol is not merely unpleasant. It can cause blindness, organ failure, and death, even in small doses. Government chemists and medical professionals knew this. They also knew that bootleggers would attempt to remove the poison through redistillation, and they knew those attempts would not fully succeed. Despite this, the policy continued. The poisoned alcohol was released into circulation with full awareness that it would end up in bars, bottles, and glasses across the country. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Hospitals reported waves of patients suffering from methanol poisoning. People who went blind within hours, collapsed after a single drink, or died in severe pain as their organs shut down. In New York City alone, hundreds of deaths were reported in a single year. Nationwide, historians estimate that thousands of people were killed or permanently injured as a direct result of poisoned alcohol during Prohibition. What makes this episode especially disturbing is how openly it was defended. When doctors, journalists, and public health officials raised concerns, federal authorities responded that anyone drinking alcohol was breaking the law and therefore responsible for the consequences. Some officials described the deaths as an unfortunate but acceptable deterrent. There was no public warning campaign, no serious effort to prevent innocent people from being harmed. The policy placed punishment above human life. It also disproportionately affected the working class, immigrants, and the poor, people who relied on cheap, unregulated alcohol, while wealthier Americans often had access to safer, legally exempt supplies. Prohibition, in practice, became a system where risk and death were unevenly distributed. The poisoning program did not end because it was exposed or condemned. It ended because prohibition itself collapsed. In 1933, alcohol was legalized again, and the practice of poisoning industrial alcohol quietly stopped. Over time, the story faded from public memory, dismissed as exaggeration or reduced to a footnote. For much of the 2010s, a quiet suspicion circulated among iPhone users. As new models were released, older iPhones seemed to slow down. Apps lagged, batteries drained faster, and devices that once felt smooth became frustrating to use. Many people believed Apple was intentionally degrading older phones to push customers toward buying newer models. At the time, the accusation was widely dismissed as a conspiracy theory. Apple denied it. The company insisted that performance issues were the natural result of aging hardware and increasingly complex software. Consumers were told nothing unusual was happening. The phones were simply getting old. But in 2017, independent developers discovered something unexpected, buried inside Apple's software updates. Certain versions of iOS were deliberately limiting the performance of older iPhones. Specifically, the operating system was reducing CPU speed on devices with aging lithium-ion batteries. Shortly after the discovery went public, Apple confirmed it. Apple explained that as batteries age, they can no longer reliably deliver peak power. When a phone suddenly demands high performance, this can cause unexpected shutdowns. To prevent this, Apple introduced a performance management system that slowed the device to maintain stability. From a technical standpoint, the explanation made sense. The controversy was not about whether batteries degrade. They do. The issue was that Apple implemented this system quietly, without clearly informing users and without offering a meaningful choice. To millions of customers, the slowdown felt indistinguishable from planned obsolescence. Phones didn't simply last less time, they felt worse to use. The response was immediate. Lawsuits were filed across the United States and internationally. Governments accused Apple of misleading consumers. In 2020, Apple agreed to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements related to the issue, while continuing to deny any wrongdoing. Only after the backlash did Apple introduce battery health indicators, performance transparency, and user controls. The company also temporarily reduced the price of battery replacements, acknowledging that many customers had replaced entire phones when a new battery would have restored performance. So the original conspiracy theory was only partially wrong. Apple did not secretly slow iPhones to force upgrades, at least not by its own account. But it did intentionally reduce performance on older devices, without clearly explaining it, and allowed users to believe their phones were simply failing on their own. For much of the Cold War, a disturbing rumor circulated in the United States that the government was secretly experimenting on its own citizens, using drugs and psychological techniques to control the human mind. People who believed it were often dismissed as paranoid, accused of confusing science fiction with reality. For years, there was no proof, only whispers, fragmented testimonies, and lives that seemed quietly ruined. Then, in the 1970s, government documents were declassified. They revealed Project MKUltra, a covert CIA program that ran primarily from the early 1950s through the 1960s. Its goal was simple in theory and extreme in practice: to understand, manipulate, and potentially control human behavior. At the height of Cold War paranoia, US intelligence feared that enemy nations were developing mind control techniques. The CIA decided it could not afford to fall behind. The experiments that followed were vast and loosely regulated. The agency tested LSD and other psychoactive drugs, hypnosis, sleep deprivation, isolation, sensory overload, and psychological stress. Many of the subjects were never informed they were part of an experiment. Some were prisoners, some were psychiatric patients, others were ordinary civilians, college students, hospital patients, even people lured into CIA-funded safe houses under false pretenses. In several cases, subjects were dosed repeatedly with powerful hallucinogens without their knowledge. Researchers observed their reactions from behind one-way mirrors. Some participants suffered severe mental breakdowns. Others required long-term hospitalization. At least one death was directly linked to the experiments, though records suggest the full number of victims may never be known. What made MKUltra especially alarming was not just the methods, but the lack of oversight. The program operated with minimal accountability, justified by national security concerns. Many experiments were conducted through front organizations, universities, and hospitals, allowing the CIA to distance itself from direct responsibility. The program might have remained hidden, if not for a series of investigations in the 1970s, prompted by growing distrust of government after the Vietnam War and Watergate. Congressional hearings uncovered fragments of MKUltra's existence. However, much of the evidence had already been destroyed. Then, CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered most MKUltra files eliminated in 1973. What survived was enough to confirm the worst fears. The US government formally acknowledged the program. Officials admitted that ethical boundaries had been crossed and that experiments had been conducted without informed consent. Apologies were issued. Limited compensation was paid to a small number of victims, but the full scope of the damage was never fully documented. Today, MKUltra is no longer debated as a theory. It is a historical fact, taught cautiously and often briefly, yet its legacy remains unsettling. It demonstrated how fear and secrecy can erode moral limits, even within democratic institutions, and it stands as a reminder that sometimes the most unbelievable accusations are dismissed not because they are false, but because they are uncomfortable to accept. The study began in 1932 in Macon County, Alabama, under the direction of the US Public Health Service. Its stated purpose was to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis. The subjects were hundreds of black men, most of them poor sharecroppers, and they were told they were being treated for a vague condition known as bad blood, a local term used to describe a range of illnesses. In reality, many of them had syphilis, and none were informed of their true diagnosis. The men were promised free medical exams, meals, and burial insurance. What they were not told was that they were part of an experiment, and that treatment was being deliberately withheld. Even when penicillin became a proven cure for syphilis in the 1940s, doctors involved in the study made the decision not to offer it. The experiment continued for decades, not because a cure was unavailable, but because researchers wanted to document what would happen if the disease was left untreated. The consequences were devastating. Many of the men died directly from syphilis or its complications. Others suffered severe organ damage, blindness, or neurological disorders. Wives were unknowingly infected. Children were born with congenital syphilis. Families were never warned. Consent was never obtained. What makes the Tuskegee study especially disturbing is how long it lasted. The experiment continued for 40 years, surviving changes in leadership, medical standards, and ethics guidelines. It was known to multiple government agencies and approved at various levels. It only ended in 1972, after a whistleblower leaked information to the press and public outrage made it impossible to continue. Subsequent investigations confirmed the facts. The government formally acknowledged the study, calling it ethically unjustifiable. In 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a public apology on behalf of the United States. Limited financial settlements were provided to survivors and families, but the damage could not be undone.